Hello everyone, and welcome to our first video lecture of the semester, Myths and Fossils, How We Look at the Distant Past. I'm going to use this lecture today to get our bearings on the subject we are studying this semester, that being world history. Now we divide the subject of world history at American River College into two parts, part one and part two you might say, and of course you are taking History 307 is the part one of the world history sequence. Basically everything from human origins to, about 500 years ago. In other words, a huge chunk of historical time. So I thought a good place to start would be the subject of history itself and how we view the very distant human history, what we call the old stuff. Because all semester long we'll be talking about history and we'll want to be confident that we know what we mean when we say history. We want to know what we mean when we say evidence. And we want to know what we mean when we say that something is historically true before. Because as it turns out, history means a couple different things. And sometimes we use it loosely to mean even more things than that. So we don't want to get confused and we don't want to use the word incorrectly. Let's get started with today's lecture then and ask, what is history? Now this first slide is going to present a kind of sub-question of that, which is where do humans come along in this story? Or at least how do we explain where we came along in the story and where it all began? The key word here is story. You notice in the word history is the word story. But we have to understand that not all stories are history stories. But all histories are stories. Look, I don't want to confuse you, so let me just break it down real quick. There are at least two ways of telling a story about where it all began. One is myth, the other is history. And if you look at this picture, I think you have no trouble understanding which it is, right? Well, not so fast. I would say that this picture represents both myth and history. And here's why. Because on the one hand, it's a painting by the Italian Renaissance painter Jacopo Tintoretto, who in 1575, that is about 450 years ago, took to painting what he called the birth of the Milky Way. So far, everything I've said about this is rendered in historical time. We know the person, the place, we know the name of the painting, we know other facts about it. What's mythological about the painting is the content of the story itself. It offers a story of how the Milky Way galaxy, that big constellational frame in which our own planet and our own solar system sit, the thing that you can actually see with the naked eye as you look up into the sky at night. The Milky Way galaxy, according to this storytelling tradition, came about when a goddess by the name of Hera, nursing an infant named Hercules held by his titular father Zeus, also a god. When that breastfeeding managed to spill, you might say, into the cosmic order. And it was from that breast milk. And you see these little cherubs here kind of observing the act. They would be our witnesses, should we call it, I guess, to trial. Observe the act of Hera's breast milk forming what would come to be known as the Milky Way. Now, why is that part of this image? Why would we consider that mythological? Well, I think the most obvious reason is because it rests on a different kind of evidence. To believe it is history, we would have to believe that all of this happened within the natural order of things. But already we're disqualified when we consider that Hera and Zeus and even Hercules, not to mention the little cherubs floating around, that they exist outside the order of nature. They are supernatural we might say, that is beyond nature, divine or cosmic beings. And it's in that fact that history divides itself from mythology. It's above our pay grade, folks. Doing history, we have to content ourselves with only what can be observed and proved within the natural order. Anything that appeals to supernatural or divine or miraculous intervention, floating cherub babies in a beautiful oil-painted constellation here. That exists outside of history, and thus we call it mythological. But both mythology and history are common to virtually all human cultures. Think of them as two options for telling a story. And it's not surprising that mythology is often the preferred option when it gets around to answering some of those big existential questions like, where do we come from? It's imagined to have been at a distant period of the past, first of all. And unless we're prepared to actually bear down and try and determine what past we're talking about in historical terms, it's easier to do like George Lucas did with Star Wars and just say long, long ago. In other words, myths don't have to concern themselves so much with dates, although we'll see here in a minute where sometimes even that gets mixed up. What we're looking at here is what we call a petroglyph, that is an image carved into rock, as it turns out in the Largo Canyon area of modern-day New Mexico. This is a representation of a Navajo deity, that is a Native American deity, and he seems to be a kind of mashup, really, between human form and maybe animal form, looking like maybe desert bighorn sheep on top of his head, horns on top of his head. This image here, what looks like maybe tail feathers, is actually a solar image. That is, the sun behind the figure, representing therefore his deified status. That is, the power that comes from the sun is seen as divine. He's holding a kind of staff, and to the side we see the concentric circles that seem to orient around a common center point. Thus we think it has to do with origins, a common place to all beings. Now we happen to know through ethnography and oral tradition that the native peoples of the desert Southwest often attributed their origins in mythological terms to a kind of divine birth, if you will, into the natural world from a place buried deep in the earth. Well, not surprising considering that part of the country is home to the famous Grand Canyon, which if you've ever stood on the rim of the canyon and looked down, you can appreciate why native peoples saw it as a suitable setting for a divine creation place. The hand, I love the handprint here. That's a kind of signature, really, that says, here we are, we human people, at this place under this divine telling of a story. So let's define myth. A traditional story, especially one concerning the early origins or history of a people, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. Yeah, beyond nature. Not all mythologies stretch beyond nature, but many of those that deal with things like origins and divine beings obviously do, and it's one of the ways that we can then separate our business of history from the business of mythology, particularly as we look to the early origins of our species. Now, what purpose do these stories serve, whether history or mythology? Well, as I've already said, they address some of the most basic questions, what I call the existential questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What is our purpose? Now, in historical terms, scholars think that it was about 40,000 years ago that our ability as storytellers, that is, as human storytellers, took a huge leap forward. Was it the proteins in our brains? Was it some environmental stimulus? Well, we're not sure. All we know is that the stories got bigger, better, more complex, and more complicated beginning about 40,000 years ago. We call it the cognitive revolution. And it's that cognitive revolution that allows our species to tell such fantastical stories, whether it be mythological stories or historical stories. And which one is this, myth or history? Well, I can tell you that it was Michelangelo's depiction of God creating light. That is another one of those Italian Renaissance types. His famous Sistine Chapel ceilings paintings that you can still visit today as a tourist, although only if it's out of quarantine, of course. Michelangelo depicted a biblical story, a story steeped in cosmology and mythology, a divine act of creation. Now, insofar as it goes, it's not hugely different from what we'll view in a minute from the science side, known as the Big Bang. That is a moment of creation in which all things came into being. The difference is, and why it is mythological in the telling, is that it relies on a divine figure to do that creating. And how does mythology frame our traditional creation stories? Well, let's take once again from the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, book of Genesis, chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a vast waste. Darkness covered the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And I really love this Michelangelo painting, not only because, boy, he sure did up Adam right here. Fully naked, reclining figure with all the pecs and abs, washboard abs, all the curvature of the muscular ideal of the kind of ideal masculine figure of Michelangelo's Renaissance time. But that still makes him human, right? Yeah, maybe he's a cover boy, but he's still in human form. And for that matter, so is the Lord God. So what makes it mythological is this bit right here in the middle, where the finger of God in effect touches that of Adam, creating man. Everything to the left of that midpoint we might call historical. Everything to the right we have to call mythological. Why? Because of that basic definitional difference. God represents a supernatural or divine intervention into that natural world. It doesn't mean that the painting itself is mythology, just the contents of it. We know when it was painted. We know who painted it. That's part of the natural world. But the center of the story, you might say, the inherent claim that the story makes of creation by divine or supernatural intervention belongs more properly in the mythology category of telling stories. And some would call that, in fact, a sacred mythology. Why? Because if you're of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, you regard this mythology as sacred due to the fact that it comes from the God whom you believe created you. Not to mention the scriptural tradition that lays it all out. In other words, what we call religious storytelling. So we make a distinction here because as we study world history in this course this semester, among other things we're going to have to come to terms with is this cognitive revolution and man's ability to tell sacred stories about the past, what we call mythology. The point at which man begins doing that, the way he does it, what he has to say, whether it's Buddhist or Vedic or Judeo or Persian or what have you, that is the actual religious storytelling traditions we might want to look at, we can identify them in history about when they take root, when they gain traction, and when people start to follow them. One thing we can't ever do, because it's above our pay grade as historians, is to use natural evidence, the only evidence that history can accept, to determine which, or if any, of those stories are ultimately true in the sense of faith and belief. Aren't you glad that's not my job? Aren't you glad there's no suspense waiting you to determine whether your particular religious views are true and those of your classmates false? No, we're not going to do that because that's beyond the scope of history. You're going to have to go to a different kind of authority to find that sort of answer. But what we can do is use the natural evidence to talk about how religious stories and mythological stories work their way into the human and natural story of the past. Now, one guy who tried to use that human and natural story to actually capture mythology in historical terms was the good Bishop Ussher, James Ussher, a 17th century English bishop, the Church of England, who estimated the date of creation to be 4004 BC as told in the book of Genesis. That would put it back about 6,000 years from our own time. That is, using the chronology of Genesis, the whole business of the generations, begats and other begats, counting back through lifespans of what he imagined those biblical begats translated as, to reach a date of 4004 BC. Now, whether or not you hold that as the date of creation has to do with your willingness to accept a kind of historical analysis of supernatural storytelling or mythological storytelling. It doesn't say in Genesis 4004 BC. That was Ussher's historical attempt to wring historical truth from the scriptures. As we're going to see, science has a very different estimation of time. But the biblical view then of human history beginning in a Garden of Eden, mediated through supernatural events and the intervention of God, do suggest a kind of historical cast. And again, if we use Michelangelo here, we see what appear to be human figures couched in that mythological story. Once again, Michelangelo is at least as concerned with the perfection of human anatomy as he is with biblical storytelling. He even represents the famous serpent here as a kind of quasi or mashup figure, part human, part serpent. Well, it's at that point that the story becomes supernatural. God's displeasure with man for tasting of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and the subsequent consequences for that action. All of that steeped in the supernaturalism of the storytelling of Genesis, rendered here in rather familiar historical and human form by the artist Michelangelo. I guess what I'm saying here is that we as a storytelling animal often like to mash the two together. We like it when the boundaries cross, when there's something rather mystical or magical or even super magical or supernatural about our telling of an otherwise human past. It's just how our brains work. That cognitive revolution, in other words, 40,000 years ago, gave us the ability to do both. Now, those of you who like a clearer divide between ways of knowing will put the storytelling of mythology on one shelf and the storytelling history of another. And in this case, it's that other, history storytelling, that requires a different burden of proof, based on what we say is natural evidence that can be freely examined. Your textbook author, Robert Strayer, says, as astronomers, physicists, and chemists tell it, the universe that we know began in an eruption of inconceivable power and heat. Well, look, on its face, that kind of sounds like Genesis, It kind of sounds like other stories of creation that are steeped in mythology. A moment, a Big Bang in this case, that sounds like that kind of creation epic. Although in this case, it's the evidence that makes the story different. And the evidence comes from something called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field Image of the famous telescope we know as the Hubble telescope, fired from Earth into space years ago now to gain a clearer scientific picture, you might say, of the origins of our universe. And using that natural image as refracted through the light of heavenly bodies and the knowledge of physicists regarding the properties of light, including Einstein's famous speed of light, then we get a different chronology. The light from the smallest, most red-tinted galaxies originated, say the astrophysicists, approximately 13 billion years ago. A rather different assessment than you might say of Bishop Ussher's 4004 BC or 6,000 years ago time frame. But what else makes them different is not just the numbers involved and the size of those numbers, 13 billion versus 6,000, but again, the evidence upon which those numbers are based. How does science see it anyway? A cosmic calendar based on the big history view? Well, 13 billion years, it's hard to get your mind around. But if we impose it on a 12-month, 365-day calendar, the story starts to take shape. On the very first day, the very first moment of January 1st, what we call New Year's Day, the Big Bang. Note that it's not until December 24th, though, rather late in the year, that the first dinosaurs appear. And if you want to find humans, you got to go all the way to the last day, December 31st, New Year's Eve. And to get something like, recognizable history, say the pyramids of Egypt being built, hey, that's not until 11:59 and 50 seconds p.m., 10 seconds before midnight. And those of you waiting to get Columbus discovering America, that's 1 second before midnight. In other words, 1492, a famous date, about 500 years ago, a little over 500 years ago. All of that in 1 second before midnight. Well, look, this is a fun thought experiment because what it helps us do is understand big history. And it's big history that we're studying this semester. The guy who created it, Carl Sagan, an astrophysicist popular back in the 70s and 80s for his television show Cosmos. Sagan said the world is very old and human beings are very young. And to prove it, he created this 12-month calendar with the entire span, big history span of the universe from the time of the Big Bang until now. And again, late in the evening on December 31st, the first human-like creatures appear. That's us. I like it because, when we talk about ancient history, meaning that thing that doesn't matter anymore, that bad relationship that ends, somebody asks you and you say, it's ancient history. We know that means they don't want to talk about it. It doesn't matter. But does it? Look, if we see the whole period of recorded human history is happening in the last 10 seconds of an entire year, who among us would deny that what happened 10 seconds ago matters now? Look, if only it's because your stomach is growling, or you keep looking at the clock, wondering when this lecture is going to be over, you're going to know you're connected to the last 10 seconds of your life. And that's what I want to say about our subject this semester. Instead of thinking of it as the distant human past, let's think of it as something in cosmic terms, as much closer to our own time. And that's part of our burden, is to answer the question, why does the history we study this semester, why does it matter? How does it matter? Because all of it occurred, remember, in the last 10 seconds. All creation stories, whether myth or history, represent our need to explain these big questions, who we are and where we came from. Yeah, the George Lucas thing, mythology with human figures in it, a kind of mashup, really, of myth and history, a galaxy far, far away, long, long ago, but looking for all the world like Carrie Fisher, looking for all the world like Harrison Ford and Billy D. Williams. Yeah, sure, we can throw an Ewok in or maybe a Darth Vader, but basically we're talking about a human story set in mythological terms. So we need to know both. Even as the one methodology of how to tell a story that we adhere to is the history side, we're going to run up constantly against mythology as we do so. And that's because, don't forget, we're the storytelling animal. And you can't do the history of humans without then coming to terms with the mythologies they create. So if we ask a question like, was Adam Homo sapiens? Adam, that figure from Genesis, that figure of divine creation, was he Homo sapiens, in the biological sense of the word? Well, to look at him here in the Rembrandt rendition, he sure seems biologically human, doesn't he? But remember, it's not the appearance, it's the evidence. And if we're going to do evidence in Genesis, we're going to say it's God speaking and creating human beings in his own image. If we're going to do it in biological terms, though, we're going to say, no, it was about 250,000 years ago, and it was a process of evolution. Strayer says, we too emerged first in Africa and quite recently, probably no more than 250,000 years ago. Remember, that's recently in terms of the cosmic calendar. But we didn't come all at once. Hey, I still remember from my high school biology, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that classification system of science that groups all living beings, say, in the animal kingdom, including Homo sapiens, us. But it's in this last classification, species, that we begin to understand that we did not emerge in a single moment of creation, but according to the biological understanding of evolving life forms, the theory of evolution, we were the product of changes over time. So which is this gal right here, known as the Venus of Dolny Vestinice? She dates to about 25 to 29,000 years ago. Is she mythology or is she history? Well, again, it's kind of a trick question. I mean, on one hand, the carved figure itself is clearly history. That is, someone, Homo sapien, sat down 25 to 29,000 years ago and carved it painstakingly from a piece of rock. It's what we might call Stone Age Michelangelo. But representing a female form with exaggerated breasts, exaggerated hips and belly, was it meant to suggest something divine? Something cosmic, something mythic? Well, we don't know, because we don't have any additional explanation, just the figure itself. Now, as historians, we would study a figure like this in context with other similar figures. We call them Venus figures, in fact, that were found in different cultures at different times in the ancient past, part of that cognitive revolution of storytelling. We keep coming back to the fact that history has its own ways of knowing. It's a discipline, the discipline of history, which means how we tell the story. Defined here in just working terms as a method of empirical inquiry. It belongs in the same category of analysis as science in that respect, looking to natural rather than supernatural causes and contexts. In that sense, it's a bit like science, you might say, and certainly history often uses scientific evidence. But the key words here are empirical and natural. Empirical means we can observe it, we can study it in our own time. Natural means that it's part of the natural world. I should tell you that the word itself, history, comes from the ancient Greeks. This guy, in fact, Herodotus, the Greek writer who lived during the 400s BCE, that is to say, about 24 to 2500 years ago, often called the father of history because he wrote a book called, well, the Histories. The word meant, from the Greek, to inquire, historia, to inquire, to ask questions, in this case, to ask questions about the past. And what made Herodotus different than the other, say, poets and mythologists of ancient Greek, the kind of folks who told the, Milky Way galaxy story as an example of sloppy breastfeeding? What's different is there's no attempt to appeal to divine authority, no attempt to appeal to the supernatural. Herodotus understood history to involve men and nature rather than gods and cosmic drama. And ever since then, historians have held themselves to that restriction, you might say, and not equating sacred mythology for history studied in the tradition of the Greeks. It's the basic definition that determines what it is we do. There's different ways of telling a story, but history does not allow itself to use supernatural claims as evidence of the past. We must work within the realm of evidence, the realm of evidence that is determined by this empirical process of observation. I mean, literally, the word evidence comes from the Latin meaning obvious to the mind or eye. And we're going to see not all evidence is that which we can see with the eye, but a lot of it we can. The ruins of ancient Persepolis, the fragments of writing called the Dead Sea Scrolls, or even, in the case of fossils dug from the earth, in this case, of one of our ancestral figures, that is, ancestors of Homo sapien, known as Homo erectus. So, how we frame the evidence determines whether the story we're telling is the story of history or the story of mythology. And that basic dividing line is that dividing line between the natural and the supernatural realms. All right, so this is going to end the first part of our lecture, part 1. I'm going to break it up just so it's a bit more manageable for you. You can come back to part 2 to see how we take a much closer look at evidence to refine our sense of what history is and how it differs from mythology.